The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the cold concrete walls of the prison. Inside, Officer Daniel Graves sat on the edge of his bunk, his head bowed, his hands trembling. The weight of his wrongful conviction pressed down on him like a mountain. 5 years. 5 years since he had last seen the outside world, since he had last seen her. His partner, his best friend, his K9, Shadow. The thought of her brought a sharp pain to his chest. She had been more than just a dog. She had been his lifeline, his confidant, his family. The letter from the warden had arrived that morning. Denied. Again. His request to see Shadow one last time had been denied. The cancer was spreading, and the doctors had given him months, maybe weeks. He couldn't die without seeing her. He just couldn't. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, pulling him from his thoughts. The cell door creaked open, and a guard stepped inside. "Graves, you've got a visitor." Daniel frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. His lawyer had stopped returning his calls months ago, and his family had long since given up on him. He stood slowly, his body aching from the toll of illness and despair, and followed the guard down the dimly lit corridor. When he entered the visitation room, his heart stopped. There, on the other side of the glass, sat a woman he didn't recognize. She was in her late 30s, with sharp green eyes and a determined set to her jaw. She picked up the phone on her side, and after a moment's hesitation, he did the same. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said. "I'm a journalist. I've been looking into your case." Daniel's breath caught. He had heard that before. Reporters had come and gone, promising to expose the truth, but nothing ever came of it. Still, there was something about her. Something in her eyes that made him want to believe. "Why now?" he asked. "Because I think I've found something," she said, leaning forward. "Something that could prove your innocence." Daniel's heart raced. He wanted to hope, but hope had burned him too many times before. "What is it?" Evelyn hesitated, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "I can't say much here. It's too risky. But I need your help. I need you to tell me everything you remember about the night of the robbery. Every detail, no matter how small." Daniel's mind flashed back to that night. The call had come in late, a suspected break-in at a jewelry store. He and Shadow had been the first on the scene. They had entered the building, and everything had gone wrong. Shots were fired, and when the dust settled, one of the suspects was dead, and Daniel was holding the murder weapon. The security footage had been mysteriously erased, and his fellow officers had testified against him. He had been set up, but he had never been able to prove it. He spent the next hour recounting every detail to Evelyn, his voice growing weaker as he spoke. When he finished, she nodded, her expression grim. "I'll be in touch," she said, standing. "And Daniel, I'll do everything I can to get you out of here." As she left, Daniel felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But it was short-lived. The next day, he received news that Shadow had been retired from the force and adopted by a family in another state. His heart shattered. He would never see her again. Weeks passed, and Daniel's health continued to decline. He had given up on Evelyn, convinced that she, like so many others, had abandoned him. But then, one night, as he lay in his bunk, the cell door opened again. "Graves, let's go," the guard said. "Where?" Daniel asked, too weak to argue. "You'll see." He was led to a small, dimly lit room. Inside, Evelyn was waiting, along with a man Daniel didn't recognize. The man was holding a file folder, his expression unreadable. "Daniel," Evelyn said, her voice urgent. "This is Detective Mark Harris. He's been working with me on your case." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What's going on?" Detective Harris stepped forward, opening the folder. "We found something," he said. "A witness who was too scared to come forward 5 years ago. He saw everything that night. He saw the real shooter." Daniel's heart pounded. Who was it? Harris hesitated, then said, "One of your fellow officers. He's been dirty for years, but we could never prove it. Until now." Daniel felt a surge of emotion, anger, relief, disbelief. "What happens now?" "Now," Evelyn said, "we get you out of here." The next few days were a blur. The witness's testimony, combined with new evidence Evelyn and Harris had uncovered, was enough to reopen the case. Daniel's conviction was overturned, and he was released from prison. But his freedom was bittersweet. He was a free man, but he was dying, and Shadow was gone. As he stepped out of the prison gates, the sunlight felt foreign on his skin. Evelyn was waiting for him, her car idling at the curb. "Where to?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "There's something I need to do." Evelyn nodded, as if she had been expecting this. "Let's go." They drove in silence, the miles stretching out before them. When they finally arrived at their destination, Daniel's breath caught. It was a small, picturesque house on the edge of a forest. And there, lying on the porch, was Shadow. She was older now, her muzzle gray, but her eyes were the same, bright, alert, full of life. When she saw Daniel, she stood slowly, her tail wagging tentatively. Daniel fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Shadow," he whispered. She limped toward him, her movement stiff with age. But when she reached him, she nuzzled his hand, a soft whine escaping her throat. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her fur. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Evelyn watched from the car, her own eyes glistening with tears. She had done it. She had given him this moment. And as she drove away, leaving Daniel and Shadow to their reunion, she knew it was enough. But the story didn't end there. Daniel's fight wasn't over. With Evelyn's help, he began to rebuild his life, determined to make the most of the time he had left. And Shadow? She never left his side. Together, they faced the world, proving that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. Always. Daniel and Shadow spent their days in quiet companionship, the bond between them as strong as ever. The old K9, though slower and grayer, still carried the same fierce loyalty in her eyes. Daniel, despite his failing health, found a renewed sense of purpose in caring for her. They took long walks through the forest near the house, Daniel leaning on a cane, Shadow trotting faithfully by his side. For a while, it seemed as though time had granted them a second chance. But the cancer was relentless. Daniel's strength waned with each passing day, and the pain grew harder to ignore. He tried to hide it from Shadow, but she knew. She always knew. On the days when he could barely get out of bed, she would lie beside him, her head resting on his chest, as if her presence alone could keep him alive. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the forest, Daniel sat on the porch with Shadow at his feet. He stroked her head gently, his fingers trembling. "You've always been my hero, girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Shadow looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with an understanding that went beyond words. She licked his hand, a soft whine escaping her throat. Daniel's vision blurred with tears. "I'm so sorry, Shadow. I wish I could stay with you longer. I wish I could make it all right." The days that followed were a blur of pain and exhaustion. Evelyn visited often, bringing food and medicine, but there was little she could do. Daniel's time was running out, and they both knew it. One night, as a storm raged outside, Daniel lay in bed, his breathing shallow and labored. Shadow lay beside him, her head resting on his chest, her body warm against his. He reached out a trembling hand to stroke her fur, his heart breaking at the thought of leaving her. "I love you, Shadow," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You'll always be my partner. Always." Shadow lifted her head, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, it was as if she understood. She nuzzled his hand, her tail giving a weak thump against the bed. Then, with a soft sigh, she laid her head back down, her breathing slow and steady. Daniel closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He felt Shadow's warmth against him, her heartbeat a comforting rhythm in the darkness. And as the storm outside raged on, he drifted into a peaceful sleep, his hand resting on her fur. When Evelyn arrived the next morning, she found them just like that. Daniel, his face serene, his hand still resting on Shadow's head. And Shadow, her eyes closed, her body still. They had left this world together, as they had always been. Partners, friends, family. Evelyn knelt beside the bed, her tears falling freely. She had given Daniel his freedom, his reunion with Shadow, and in the end, she had given him peace. But the loss was profound, a reminder of the injustice that had stolen so much from him. In the days that followed, Evelyn made sure they were buried side by side, under a tree in the forest they had loved. A simple marker bore their names: Daniel Graves and Shadow, partners forever. And though their story was one of tragedy, it was also one of love and loyalty, a testament to the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. In the end, they had found their way back to each other, and in that, there was a kind of victory. But for those who knew them, the ache of their absence would linger, a quiet reminder of what had been lost.